going to be called atoms, molecules, and compounds. And the first thing we're going to do is start out with 6 different things. And I want you guys to rank these 6 different things in order from smallest, number 1, to largest, number 6. Okay? So the first thing is going to be a cell. And for the purpose of this activity, we're going to give it a specific type of cell. We're going to say it's some kind of prokaryotic cell, which is going to be like bacteria and stuff. Those are the smallest type of cells. Okay. The second thing is going to be glucose, which the formula for glucose is C6H12O6. The third thing is going to be a nitrogen atom. Fourth thing is going to be a neutron. Fifth thing is going to be a protein. And again, there's lots of different types of proteins. So we're going to say, for this specific example, we'll say it's hemoglobin. That's the protein that moves oxygen around in your blood. And then the last thing is going to be a salt formula unit, specifically table salt, which is sodium chloride. Salt formula unit, which is NaCl. Okay, so take a minute and organize these from smallest, which is 1, to largest on your paper. So order smallest to largest. Yeah, we don't do that in here. Everybody good? All right. So now I want you to take a minute and talk with your table partner and say what you thought, what you got. Oh, yeah. Here, grouping with these 3. Break in. Say, excuse me. Group of 3. That's fine. All right. So, the reason why we do this is because there's lots of things that we have to talk about in this class, and they're going to be like orders of magnitude bigger or smaller than each other, but they're all going to be so small that you can't see them with your eyes, right? So like a cell, I'll give it away. The cell is the biggest thing up there, right? And it's super, 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 super big, and you can't see it with your eyes, right? And the other stuff is smaller. So what's the smallest thing up there? The neutron. In fact, we're just going to use the molecular mass of it instead of trying to figure out like radii and stuff like that. We're just going to go by the mass. So the neutron has a really easy mass to learn. It's 1 atomic mass unit, right? It's like the definition of atomic mass unit is the mass of a neutron. right? So what's the next biggest thing? Nitrogen atom. If you look on the periodic table, the nitrogen atom is 14 AMU if you're talking about nitrogen 14, which is the most abundant type of nitrogen. What else? What's next? Yeah. Protein. Nope. What do you think? Salt formula unit is 58 AMU. Right? What's next? What do you think? Glucose is about 180 AMU. What's next? Protein. So given these numbers, anybody want to venture a guess at the atomic mass of a protein? You're right to not do it. All right, so protein, specifically hemoglobin, this one's made up of 4 subunits, smaller subunits, and each of the smaller subunits of hemoglobin is around 16,000 AMU. That makes the protein hemoglobin 64,000 AMU. That's a lot, right? Yes? So if you were looking at the difference between glucose and a protein, you could fit a lot of glucoses in the same place that you could fit one protein, right? Okay, what about a cell then? What's a cell made out of? Proteins, among other things, right? And so there's almost no estimation that I can give here for the size of this, but I can tell you that a prokaryotic cell is a bacteria, right? And so it's got some stuff in it. It's got like ribosomes in it, and it's got DNA in it, right? And the average mass of the DNA within a bacterial cell is about 1 × 10⁹ power, right? That's just the DNA, not everything else. So if I was going to estimate, I'd maybe say 1 × 10⁻11th or 12th, right? But you can't know that exact number because it's different numbers of ribosomes and organelles and stuff like that. So for this, we're just going to say a lot. It's a lot of AMU, okay? Many more than anything else up here. If you really wanted to put a number, you could put like 1 × 10⁻12th, I guess. Okay? So the point is that cells can fit all this other stuff really, really easily. And all these other things are going to be in cells, right? So you're going to have some nitrogen, dissolved nitrogen floating around inside cells. You're going to have sodium and chlorine inside cells. You're going to have glucose inside cells. You're going to have proteins. That's really what the cell is made out of, among other things like phospholipids and stuff. But it's important to realize the difference in size here, to realize that a cell is orders of magnitude larger than everything else up there, right? Okay, let's talk about atoms, the smallest thing. The smallest unit of an element. And if you step back and think about what that means, it means, okay, if I want to say that I have an atom of nitrogen, right? If I want to say the smallest part, the smallest little thing of nitrogen that I could have, it would be an atom of nitrogen, and that atom of nitrogen would have 7 protons and 7 neutrons and 7 electrons. But the second that I start looking at the electrons and the protons and neutrons, I'm not looking at nitrogen anymore. I have to look at that whole thing, that whole conglomeration of protons, neutrons, and electrons to be looking at nitrogen, right? That's called an atom of nitrogen. Not to say that there's not smaller things in there like protons, neutrons, and electrons. Of course, there are those things, but at that point, it's not nitrogen anymore. It's just protons, neutrons, and electrons, okay? So protons and neutrons, those things are going to be in the nucleus. And those things have mass. Okay? The electrons are not in the nucleus. The electrons are in this area that we refer to as the electron cloud. They're kind of just whirling about outside the nucleus. right? So in the electron cloud, they have no important amount of mass. Their mass is negligible, meaning that they do actually have some mass, but it's so small compared to the mass of the protons and the neutrons that we don't even consider it in the overall mass of the atom. Okay, so very, very small mass. Okay, but the most important thing here is that the electrons are going to be involved in chemical reactions. And in chemistry, you learn about both chemical reactions and nuclear reactions, right? But there are no nuclear reactions for biology, none. There's no living thing that has like a little fission engine inside or anything like that. It would be really cool if there were, but there's not. Okay, so electrons are going to be involved in all the things that are happening inside of a cell, and therefore they're the thing that we're going to focus on the most in here. Okay, so if atoms are the smallest unit of an element, what is an element then? An element is just an atom with a specific number of protons. Okay, so how do we figure out the number of protons? We look on that periodic table thing. And so I can look at carbon, for instance, and above carbon there's the number 6, which tells me that 6 is the atomic number, so there must be 6 protons in it. That's correct. Let's draw some carbon then. We're going to specifically draw something called carbon 12. Okay, so if we were drawing carbon 12, like I said, it has 6 protons in it. So in the nucleus here, I'll do the nucleus in red so it doesn't get confused with an orbital, right? There's going to be 6 protons. And then if it's 12, and we said that protons and neutrons are the only thing that have mass, then the neutrons must be the rest of the mass. So we take 12 minus 6. And we figure out that there's 6 neutrons in there, right? 6p plus 6n0. Okay, then we have some electrons, and we're going to draw the Bohr's model of the atom, if you remember that from chemistry. That's going to be the one that shows the orbitals around here. So there's 2 electrons in the first orbital. You might remember from chemistry that is the 1s2 electron configuration. And then the second one, sure, why not? It's going to have 4 electrons in it so that we have 6 electrons total, right? So that second energy level is going to be the 2s2 and the 2p2 in this case. Again, not super important if you don't remember that. But the really important thing to note is that most atoms are going to want to have 8 electrons in their outer shell. And so this one has 4 electrons, and that means it's going to want to form a bond right here, it's going to want to form a bond right here, it's going to want to form a bond right here, and it's going to want to form a bond right here. Okay? And that's great because that means that there are 4 spots to bond to other atoms, right? That's why we call ourselves carbon-based life forms. Lots of people think, okay, carbon-based life forms, that means that the most abundant atom in our body is carbon. It's not even close, right? What's most of our body made out of?
Water.
Water. Is there carbon in water? No, just hydrogen and oxygen. So by far, the most abundant atom in your body is hydrogen. By far. All right? So why do we call ourselves carbon-based life forms? Because if you didn't have carbon, you couldn't make the really complex molecules that it takes to make life. Okay? So carbon 12 here. There's another type of carbon too. Well, there's a couple other ones, but we're just going to draw another one. Carbon 14, and it's mostly the same. So it's got a nucleus, and in that nucleus there's going to be 6 protons still because it's still got to be carbon, but now it's got 8 neutrons, p plus and 0, and then around the nucleus then got the same 2 orbitals, like that. There's 2 electrons in the first orbital, and then 4 electrons in the next one. Okay. Chemically speaking, how do these atoms act differently from one another? Yeah.
Carbon 14 has 8 neutrons, while carbon 12 has only 6.
That's how they are different, but how do they act differently? Do they act differently? Yeah.
They bond differently because one has less electrons than the other.
The same number of electrons, right? They both have 6 electrons. One just has a different number of neutrons. And really, it's a trick question. They don't. They act exactly the same. Chemically, these are identical to one another. If you had a organic compound and it had carbon 14 in it, it would act no differently than an organic compound that had carbon 12 in it. Okay? So they use a term to describe that, right? And they want to get across that they're going to act the same, and so they want to use a prefix that means the same, and so they use the prefix iso, which means the same, and these are topes, isotopes. Okay? Isotopes mean there's the same number of protons and a different number of neutrons. Same number of protons, different number of neutrons. Okay? So I told you that the electrons were the important thing. These ones have different number of neutrons. So why do we care for biology? Yeah.
Did you say that neutrons had a mass of 1
It does, yep.
It does make it heavier?
It does make it heavier. Now, for a biological system, it doesn't matter at all that it's heavier. But for us to learn about biology, it matters a lot that it's heavier. Because one of the things that we can do is we can track where elements are going. Okay? So, for instance, if you have the formula 6CO2 plus 6H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2, that formula is what we call photosynthesis, right? One of the things we know about is that this oxygen that is in the glucose, it comes directly from the oxygen that was in the carbon dioxide. And the oxygen that was given off as waste comes from the water, right? And what that allows us to do is it allows us to know what intermediate compounds there are, what enzymes we should be looking for. And the way that we figured it out is all you got to do is you got to make some compounds that have some funky oxygen in them, okay? So there's oxygen 16, that's normal oxygen, and there's also oxygen 18, which is a radioactive isotope of oxygen. All right, so let's say I go through and I make a bunch of carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide that I use radioactive oxygen to make carbon dioxide, to form some carbon dioxide, right? All I have to do then is figure out, okay, if it started out in the carbon dioxide, where's it going to end up? So I let the plant go through photosynthesis with some radioactive carbon dioxide for a while, and I say, okay, was that radioactive carbon dioxide given off as oxygen, with the oxygen in it, or was it incorporated into the glucose? And one of the things that we find out is it gets directly incorporated into the glucose, so it becomes part of the plant rather than being given off as oxygen waste, right? So from a actual biological standpoint, it doesn't matter at all that they're isotopes, but from a research standpoint, that's how we figure out where these different elements are going and which enzymes are being used, and how often they're being incorporated into the cell. All those things that you're going to read about in the book, if they have to do with the actual molecular level, the way that we figured it out is by using isotopes, right? Okay, let's talk about the rest of the elements other than carbon. There are there's 118 actually, 118 elements on the periodic table, but they go all the way up to unoctium 118, but there's only 92 naturally occurring elements on Earth. The rest of them are made in particle accelerators. So 92 naturally occurring elements. Okay. There's all kinds of really interesting stuff about this. Very quickly, kind of to spark your interest if you're willing to go and research it, we know that we are at least a third generation solar system. Okay? What that means is that in a star that only has hydrogen and helium, it can only fuse elements up to iron. Okay? And so a star had to form and then blow up. Right? And then another star formed that allowed for some stuff to crash into the iron. And then that star had to make a bunch of elements and then blow up. And then when our galaxy formed, when our solar system formed, it had to be at least the third time that that stuff had formed, because we know on Earth we have elements that are heavier than iron, and therefore they had to have been forged in at least a second generation star. And so that means we must be a third generation solar system. Right? So that's very cool. But another thing I think that's very cool is that of these naturally occurring elements, the ones that are used for life are not the ones that would have to be third generation. The ones that are important for life are CHNOPS, CHNOPS, which is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are the things that are really important in living things. That means that technically speaking, it's possible for there to be life on planets that are not third generation, life on second generation planets, because those things could have been forged in a first generation star, which I think is pretty neat. Makes it more likely that there's life out somewhere else in the universe. Okay? Let's talk about bonding, how these things are going to bond together. Chemical bonding. So there's two types of bonds. There's ionic bonding and covalent bonding, and the difference is how the electrons are being utilized, whether they're being shared or transferred. So electrons are transferred or shared to fill the outer shell of electrons. Those electrons are called valence electrons, the outer shell. And for the most part, we can say that this is going to be conforming to what we call the octet rule, because as we said, they want to have 8 electrons in their outer shell. What's up?
So would like carbon 12 have 4 valence electrons?
Exactly, yep, because the outer shell has the 4 dots on it, right? So, generally speaking, again, this is the octet rule. But again, it can be a little bit different than that. There's the duet rule, which hydrogen and helium fall into, where they only want 2. And then there's weird elements like boron. Boron only wants 6 valence electrons, or can handle having just 6. But for the most part, we're just going to say 8 is the number we're going to go with. Okay? So the first type of bond that we're going to look at is covalent bonding. That is sharing outer shell electrons. And that makes sense because co is the prefix that means to share, right? Like if you cooperate with somebody, you share the operation with them. That's you're allowing both of you to be in that thing, right? Covalent means sharing valent. Valence. Sharing valence electrons. That's all it means, right? So, a covalent compound, let's look at something like methane, for instance. Methane is CH4. So if I was going to draw methane being covalently bonded, I would say, okay, you've got carbon in the middle, then you've got hydrogen all around it. As we said before, carbon has 4 valence electrons, so we draw the 4 valence electrons in, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And hydrogen has 1 valence electron, so 1, for that one for that one for that one, and one for that one. And then you can go through and draw the Venn diagram for it and say, this hydrogen has these 2 electrons because it only needs 2 because of the duet rule. This hydrogen has these 2. This hydrogen has these 2. This hydrogen has these 2. And then finally, the carbon gets 8. And any places where those circles intersect, that, just like in a Venn diagram, means that they are sharing those things. Okay? Covalent compound. Make sense? Okay. Then we've got ionic bonding. Ionic bonding is the transferring of electrons. Okay, so let's look at sodium chloride. Okay, sodium chloride has a sodium and a chlorine. And the sodium has 1 valence electron, and the chlorine has 7 valence electrons. And so the sodium just transfers its 1 electron out here. And if it has 1 less electron now, electrons have a negative charge. So that means that the sodium ends up having a positive charge, because it's got 1 less electron, 1 less negative charge now. And then the chlorine is going to end up with a negative charge. And so we end up with what's called a sodium ion and a chloride ion, okay? Which makes sense because this is ionic bonding, right? And ions are formed in ionic bonding, right? Make sense? Okay, let me check real quick when this period ends. 11:30. All right, polarity is the last thing that we're going to talk about. So, polarity just means how the electrons are being shared. Are they being shared evenly or are they being shared unevenly? Uneven charges within atoms. Okay, and there's 2 types of polarity. The first type is called molecular polarity. Okay, and molecular polarity has to do with the overall polarity of the molecule, and it's based on its shape. Okay, so overall polarity based on shape. Okay, and you might remember the shapes from chemistry. It's not super important that you do. The non-expanded shapes are just bent or linear, and then trigonal planar or trigonal pyramidal, and then tetrahedral. And of those, bent and trigonal pyramidal are polar, and then trigonal planar, linear, and tetrahedral are nonpolar. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's look at some examples. Let's look at water. It's going to have oxygen here. It's a bent molecule, so it's bonded to 2 hydrogens like this, and it's bent because you've got these lone pairs of electrons at the top that are pushing everything down, like that. And so the way that I tell people to figure out if the shape is going to be polar or nonpolar is by looking if the left and the right side are exactly the same and the top and the bottom are exactly the same. Okay? So are the left side and the right side exactly the same here? Yes. Are the top and the bottom the same? No. That means it is polar on the top to bottom plane, right? And so we would say that this is going to be partially positive, and this is partially positive. The thing that I've drawn there is the lowercase delta. It's a D with a tail on it, or a 8th note. And then this top is going to be partially negative. Okay, so the top of a water molecule, or the oxygen portion of a water molecule, is partially negative, whereas the hydrogen portion is partially positive. Okay? If we were looking at a nonpolar molecule, right? A nonpolar molecule would be something like carbon dioxide, where you'd have carbon in the middle and oxygen on the outside. Okay? Is the left side the same as the right side? Yes. Is the top the same as the bottom? Yes. So it's the same. It's nonpolar, right? That makes this one polar and this one non-polar from a molecular standpoint. Okay? The last thing is the bond polarity. Okay? And bond polarity refers to the uneven sharing of electrons in each individual bond. Okay? The sharing of electrons in each chemical bond. Okay? So, let's look at water again. Okay, so here's oxygen, here's hydrogen, here's hydrogen. Oxygen and hydrogen are going to share electrons because they're covalently bonded to each other. Okay? I will tell you a secret. It's not a secret. I shared a car with my sister when I was in high school. My sister's 3 years older than me. She was in college locally by the time I was driving. And so she was 19 and I was 16. And so I shared a car with my sister. And what that means is if my sister came home to like do laundry, I could have the car for 15 minutes or 20 minutes while she was doing laundry. Or if she like needed to take a nap, she would be like, okay, I'm going to take a nap for an hour so you can have the car, but if you're not back by 4, I'm going to punch you in the face. Right? That's how we shared. And so that's sort of the way that the electrons are shared in water. Okay? Oxygen happens to be really, really good at attracting electrons. Hydrogen happens to be kind of bad at it. Okay? So if we were going to draw their shared orbitals here, we would say that they would look like the tears of my high school experience from not having a car. Like this. We would say that the hydrogen would spend almost no time with the electrons and the oxygen would spend a lot of time with the electrons. And that is going to result in the electrons being pulled away from the hydrogen, right? And electrons have a negative charge, which again is why this is going to be partially positive. And this is going to be partially negative.
The sixth period and first lunch. We will make the call, so please do not release your kids for second or third lunch until we make that call. However, we do hope to stay on time today. Thank you.
This is in contrast to something like methane. Methane has carbon and hydrogen in it. And carbon and hydrogen have very similar electronegativities. And so that means that they're going to share nice and evenly like this. There's going to be these nice little circles in between them to say that the electrons are going to stay somewhere in that even area there. Okay? So that means that each of the individual bonds between carbon and hydrogen here in methane are nonpolar, as well as being a nonpolar shape, tetrahedral. Okay? Each of the individual bonds in the water here are polar, as well as being a polar shape. Okay? So that means that the water is going to be superpolar. That means that the methane is going to be super nonpolar. Okay? If you're curious as to the electronegativities for these, oxygen is something like 3.44, hydrogen is something like 2.2, and carbon I think is 2.4. So if you looked at the difference between carbon and hydrogen, it would be 0.2, whereas if you looked at the difference between oxygen and hydrogen, it would be 1.2. So you can see that the oxygen is significantly greater, or significantly better at attracting electrons, and that's why it's polar. Questions on that? All right, that's it.